The taste of dust in Goldridge's auction square was bitter as betrayal. Eleanor Harmon knew that flavor well. It had coated her tongue for 6 months, ever since they'd lowered her husband's pine coffin into the frozen ground and his half-brother's shadow had fallen across her life, like a winter night with no end. She stood at the edge of the jeering crowd, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, where Jacob's child grew. 7 months along now, the weight of it a constant reminder of all she had to protect, and all she stood to lose. The other hand clutched her wedding ring, a simple band of gold that caught the harsh California sun. The last thing of value she owned. A woman should never have to choose between her dignity and survival. Jacob had said the day he slipped that ring onto her finger, "Promise me you'll never forget your worth, Ella, no matter what happens." The memory of his voice, so clear it might have been whispered in her ear that very moment, made her throat tighten. What would Jacob think of her now, of the choice she was contemplating? In the center of the square stood a crude iron cage. Inside, a man knelt built of mountain and shadow, with hair as black as ravine water and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the Sierra peaks. His hands were bound behind him, and a lattice of fresh wounds crossed his back, the blood dried to the color of rust against his copper skin. A mixture of white and native blood was evident in his features, high cheekbones and a proud nose, but with eyes the color of a winter sky. Pressed against his side was a small boy, no more than 6 years old, with those same striking eyes. The child's face was a mask of silent terror, but he made no sound. His tiny fingers gripped the torn fabric of the man's trousers. "Next up, Warren Simmons," the auctioneer called out with theatrical flair, his sweaty collar tight against his neck, despite the autumn chill. This savage was caught poaching on Golden Sierra Mining Company land. The crowd murmured. A few men spat on the ground. The war between the states had ended 20 years ago, but the West had its own battles still raging between miners and natives, between those who saw the land as something to be conquered and those who saw it as something to be revered. "Calls himself Nathaniel Redpath," Simmons continued, prodding the cage with his cane. "Half-breed Miwok, half trouble, comes with the pup. What am I bid for this beast? Good for scaring crows, maybe." Laughter rippled through the crowd. A few copper coins were tossed toward the cage, more insult than offer. Ella's gaze moved across the familiar faces of Goldridge people who had once nodded respectfully when she passed on Jacob's arm. Mrs. Porter, who had brought soup when she was sick last winter. Tom Ferguson, whose broken leg Jacob had helped set after a mining accident. Reverend Armstrong, who had officiated their wedding 3 years ago. Now they looked through her as if she were already a ghost. 6 months a widow had taught her invisibility. Her eyes caught on Edgar Harmon, her brother-in-law, standing near the front of the crowd. At 42, he was a dozen years older than Jacob had been. Where her husband had been lean and quick to smile, Edgar was broad and solemn, with a beard the color of rusted iron, and eyes the cold blue of a winter sky. Edgar had fought in the war, returned with medals and nightmares. He drowned in whiskey. Jacob had once told her that Edgar had been different, before kinder, less bitter. But the war had changed him, as it had changed so many. And when their father died, leaving the bulk of his estate to Jacob instead of Edgar, something had broken for good between the brothers. Edgar was laughing now, encouraging the mockery, his voice carrying over the crowd. The same voice that had feigned sympathy at Jacob's funeral, the same voice that had later informed Ella that she would need to vacate the family home, as it was Harmon property, and she was merely a temporary addition. $5, someone called out just to hear the crowd laugh again. $5 once, Simmons announced. $5 twice, In the cage, the man they called Nathaniel still had not looked up. His attention was fixed entirely on the child his body positioned to shield the boy from the crowd's view. It was not the posture of a savage. It was the instinct of a father. The boy's eyes, wide and haunted, suddenly found Ella's across the square. In them, she saw no tears, only a terrifying emptiness that mirrored what she saw in her own mirror each morning. The hollow stare of someone who had lost everything and expected to lose what little remained. In that moment of connection, something shifted inside her. A resolve taking shape, defying logic and caution. Jacob's voice again in her memory. The measure of a society isn't how it treats the powerful Ella. It's how it treats those it has rendered powerless. Her fingers tightened around her wedding ring. The gold was warm from her grip, a memory of warmth, of safety. It was all she had left, of love. Sold to, Simmons began. Wait! Ella's voice surprised her, a dry whisper she hardly recognized. She pushed through the crowd, people parting before her with murmurs of pity and contempt. She felt their eyes on her swollen belly, on her worn dress that had once been her finest. She walked to the auctioneer's block and held out her hand. The gold ring lay stark against her palm. This, she said. I'll give this. The auctioneer stared, then a slow, greedy smile spread across his face as he recognized the value of the wedding band. Well, well, he said, the widow Harmon surprises us all. He snatched the ring. Sold, he boomed, gesturing to her. To the widow. The crowd fell into a stunned, confused silence. Then Edgar pushed forward, his face flushing with rage beneath his beard. Have you lost your mind? He snarled, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. That ring is Harmon property. Ella met his gaze steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs. It was given to me by my husband. It's mine to do with as I please. Your husband, Edgar spat the word, would be ashamed to see you wasting good gold on this animal. But Ella saw something beneath Edgar's rage, a flicker of calculation of assessment. This wasn't just about the ring or the native man. This was about control, about demonstrating to everyone in Goldridge that Ella Harmon was no longer under the protection of the Harmon name, no longer deserving of respect. From behind, Edgar came the tall, spare figure of Reverend Armstrong, his face a mask of disapproval beneath his wide-brimmed black hat. Such a tragedy, the Reverend said, not to Ella, but to the crowd. To see Jacob Harmon's widow fallen so low. Living alone, and now? He gestured to the cage with undisguised contempt. Consorting with savages. Ella felt her cheeks burn, but kept her chin high. The key, she said to Simmons, ignoring both men. The auctioneer dropped the iron key into her palm with a theatrical bow. He's all yours, Mrs. Harmon. May God have mercy on your soul. The crowd laughed nervously. Ella approached the cage. The lock was stiff with rust, and her fingers trembled as she worked it. The crowd watched, waiting for her to be attacked, waiting for her foolishness to be punished. The lock finally clicked open. The cage door swung wide. The man called Nathaniel did not move. He watched her, his body coiled like a spring ready to release. The boy remained pressed against his side, half hidden. Ella took a step back, giving them space. She did not look at him as an owner looks at property. She looked at him as one wounded soul recognizing another. My cabin is 2 miles up Trinity Pass, she said quietly. You're free to come or go as you please. She turned and began walking toward the edge of town, her heart hammering in her chest. She did not look back to see if they followed. though every instinct screamed for her to run to get away from the hostile stares and whispered judgments. Edgar's voice carried across the square. "You'll regret this, Ella. When that savage slits your throat in the night, remember I warned you." She kept walking her head high, despite the weight in her belly and the ache in her heart. Only when she reached the edge of town did she allow herself a moment's pause, leaning against a pine tree to catch her breath. What had she done? Traded her most precious possession for a man who might well disappear into the forest without a backward glance, for a child who looked at her with the same haunted eyes she saw in the mirror. Sometimes courage looks like folly to those without it, Jacob had told her once. The memory steadied her. Whatever came next, she had done what she thought right, what Jacob would have done. The path to her cabin wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, the latter beginning to turn gold with autumn's approach. The air was crisp with the promise of an early winter. Ella walked steadily, conserving her strength. Each step took her further from the town and its judgment, but closer to the uncertainty of what she had just done. Behind her, at a distance of about 30 paces, came the soft footfalls of Nathaniel and the boy. They followed like shadows, making barely a sound. Whenever she glanced back, Nathaniel's eyes were scanning the trees, the path, the sky, everywhere but at her. The boy stayed close to his father's side, his small hand clutching the man's trousers. As the path grew steeper, Ella's breath came harder. The child within her seemed to press against her lungs, leaving little room for air. A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and stumble. Before she could fall, a strong hand gripped her arm, steadying her. Nathaniel had closed the distance between them in an instant. This close, she could see the flecks of darker blue in his winter sky eyes, the tension in his jaw, the careful way he held himself to appear less threatening despite his height. "The baby," he said, his voice deep and rough, like stones grinding together. "Not right." They were the first words he had spoken, and they surprised her with their directness. "It's just the climb," she managed, catching her breath. "I'm fine." Nathaniel's gaze dropped to her belly, and something like concern flickered across his face before he withdrew his hand and stepped back. "Thank you," she said. He gave the slightest nod, then gestured for her to continue. This time he and the boy followed more closely, ready to catch her if she stumbled again. By the time they reached the small clearing where her cabin stood, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire. The cabin was little more than a shack propped against a hillside, as if it were too tired to stand on its own. The door hung on one hinge, and the roof sagged in the middle, where rain had found its way through. Weeds choked what had once been a garden, and the single window was patched with oilcloth instead of glass. It was a place of last resort, the only thing Edgar hadn't managed to take from her after Jacob's death. Once it had been the Harmon hunting cabin, a place of happy memories. She and Jacob had spent their first week as husband and wife here planning their future, while the autumn leaves fell around them. Now it was a symbol of how far she had fallen. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and loneliness. A small stone hearth dominated one wall, cold ashes filling its belly. A rough table with a single chair stood in the center of the room, and a straw pallet lay in the corner covered with a threadbare quilt. "It's not much," she said, turning to where she expected Nathaniel to be behind her. But he and the boy remained outside, standing at the edge of the clearing. Nathaniel's eyes swept over the dilapidated shelter, taking in the leaking roof, the broken door, the cold hearth. Then his gaze moved to the surrounding trees, the slope of the hill, the small stream that bubbled nearby. He was assessing the terrain, she realized, looking for escape routes, for dangers, for resources. He looked back at her, and for the first time since the auction really seemed to see her. He took in her exhaustion, the pallor of her skin, the way her hands trembled slightly. His expression gave away nothing, but something in his stance shifted less wary, more watchful in a different way. Without a word, he guided his son to a spot beneath the cabin's small overhang, sheltered from the wind. He indicated with a gentle pressure on the boy's shoulder that he should sit. Then he turned and walked toward the edge of the woods. Ella watched uncertainty and resignation warring within her. Had she just traded her last treasure for nothing? Would he simply disappear into the forest with his son? She went inside and found a pot, her hands moving automatically through the motions of making a thin soup from the last of her supplies. As she worked, her mind circled back to the auction square, to Edgar's fury, to the Reverend's condemnation. 6 months ago, she had been respected, comfortable, loved. Now she was alone, with winter approaching, a baby coming, and a mysterious man and his silent child as her only allies, if they could even be called that. Through the open door, she saw Nathaniel return with an armload of dry wood. He dropped it near the side of the cabin, then went back for more. He moved with an economy of motion, a deep, instinctual knowledge of survival in these mountains. On his third trip, he split some of the smaller pieces with a rock, creating kindling. He arranged them carefully near the hearth, but did not come inside. Instead, he disappeared again, this time returning with 2 stones. With practiced movements, he struck them together, creating sparks that fell onto a small bundle of dry moss he had gathered. A tiny flame flickered, then grew, catching on the kindling. He fed it carefully until it burned steadily, then moved it to a flat rock near the overhang where his son sat. A small fire, enough to provide warmth without smoke that might draw attention. It was a gesture that spoke volumes. He would accept her offering of shelter, but maintain his distance, his independence. He would not be owned, not be indebted. Ella ladled some of the soup into a cracked bowl and set it outside the door, along with a piece of hard bread, half her remaining loaf. She retreated inside without a word. From her window she watched as Nathaniel took the bowl to his son, first helping him eat, before taking a few bites himself. They ate in silence, the boy's eyes heavy with exhaustion. As darkness fell completely, Ella lit a single candle and placed it in the window, an old habit from when Jacob would return late from the mine. A guide home through the darkness. She settled onto her pallet, her back aching from the day's journey, her mind too full for sleep. Outside, she could just make out the silhouettes of Nathaniel and his son, huddled together by their small fire. He sat with his back against the cabin wall. The boy curled against his chest. He did not sleep. His eyes reflected the firelight as he kept watch through the night. High on a ridge overlooking the cabin, Edgar Harmon lowered his brass spyglass. In the deepening twilight, he had watched the strange procession arrive at the old Harmon hunting cabin, Ella, the half-breed, and the child. His jaw tightened beneath his red beard. "Stupid woman," he muttered, though there was no one to hear but the wind through the pines. He tucked the spyglass into his saddlebag and mounted his horse, a sleek bay that had once belonged to Jacob. Like everything else that had been his brother's, Edgar had claimed it as his own. As he rode back toward town, his mind churned with remembered slights and fresh anger. Jacob had always been their father's favorite, despite being the younger son, despite being born to the second wife rather than the first. While Edgar had gone to fight in the war, Jacob had stayed home tending to the family business, earning their father's approval. "Edgar has courage," old Josiah Harmon had said once, not knowing Edgar overheard, "but Jacob has character." As if courage alone was not enough. As if bleeding for your country counted for nothing. When Edgar returned from the war, the nightmares dogging his sleep, and the whiskey dulling his days, Jacob had been there with that insufferable sympathy, that quiet competence. And then he'd married Ella, a shopkeeper's daughter, with no family connections, no dowry beyond her beauty and wit. Edgar had wanted her for himself, had been working up the courage to court her when Jacob swooped in with his easy charm and genuine decency. When old Josiah Harmon died, the will had been clear. The main house, the best lands, the mining shares all went to Jacob. To Edgar, he left only a modest stipend and the family name. "For your military service, I am proud," Josiah had written in a letter attached to the will. "But your temperament makes you ill-suited to manage the family holdings. Look to your brother's example." Edgar had hidden the will, claiming there was none, and as the older brother had taken control, Jacob, trusting fool that he was, had never questioned it. But then Jacob had started acting strangely, disappearing into the mountains for days, keeping secrets. And there was that damned journal he was always writing in. Edgar's hands tightened on the reins. Jacob had found something up in those mountains, something valuable enough that he'd stopped working at the mine, had started talking about building Ella a proper house in town. Gold, most likely. And that half-breed knew where it was. "You always took what should have been mine, little brother," Edgar said to the darkness. "Your death was just the beginning of setting things right." His thoughts turned to Ella. He had expected her to run back east after Jacob's death to her sister in Boston. That would have been convenient. Instead, she had stubbornly remained even after he'd claimed the house and most of their possessions as family property. Even after he'd spread rumors that Jacob had left nothing but debts. And now, with the baby coming, she was an even bigger problem. Josiah Harmon's grandchild would have a legitimate claim to everything unless Edgar could prove Ella unfit. A woman living alone in the mountains with a savage. That might be enough. The lights of Goldridge appeared below him, and Edgar straightened in the saddle. Reverend Armstrong would be waiting at the Broken Pick Saloon, eager for news. The Reverend had his own reasons for hating the natives, and Edgar knew just how to stoke that hatred to serve his purposes. By the time the snow melted in spring, Edgar would have everything that should have been his from the start. The land, the gold, and his heart quickened at the thought. Perhaps even Ella herself, once she'd been properly humbled. 3 days passed in a strange, silent dance of coexistence. Each morning, Ella would find the soup bowl clean outside her door. Each day, Nathaniel would disappear into the forest with his son, returning with small game or wild herbs. Each evening, he would build a fire outside, and they would sleep beneath the overhang while she slept within. On the 4th morning, Ella woke to the sound of hammering. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The air was sharp with frost, her breath forming clouds in the early light. Nathaniel stood on the roof of the cabin, carefully replacing broken shingles with new ones split from a fallen pine. His movements were precise, practiced. The boy sat on a stump nearby, watching his father work. He still had not spoken a single word in Ella's presence, but his eyes followed her, constantly assessing, remembering. This morning, though, there was something different in his gaze, a flicker of curiosity, where before there had been only wariness. "You don't have to do that," she called up to Nathaniel. He paused, looking down at her. "Winter's coming," he said simply, then returned to his work. 3 words, but they said everything. Winter in the Sierra was merciless. A leaking roof meant death. Ella nodded, accepting his help with the dignity it was offered. She went to the stream to fill her water bucket, struggling with its weight against the pull of her pregnancy. When she returned, Nathaniel had finished the roof and was examining the broken door hinge. "I'll fix," he said, noticing her watching. "Thank you," she replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Are you hungry? I can make breakfast." He considered this, then gave a short nod. It was the first time he had agreed to come inside. She busied herself making a simple meal of cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of her honey. Nathaniel sat at the table, visibly uncomfortable being indoors. The boy stayed close to his side, his small face solemn. "What's his name?" she asked gently, setting bowls before them. Nathaniel's hand rested protectively on the boy's shoulder. "Daniel," he said. "Hello, Daniel," she said, smiling at the child. "I'm Ella." Daniel stared at her, then looked down at his bowl, not responding. But his fingers traced the edge of the wooden table with a child's curiosity, exploring the grain of the wood. "He doesn't speak," Nathaniel said, his voice low. "Not since—" He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Not since whatever tragedy had befallen them. Ella nodded, understanding all too well how grief could steal one's voice. "That's all right," she said to Daniel. "Sometimes there are no words for what we feel." They ate in silence, but it was less strained than before. When they finished, Nathaniel took the bowls to the stream and washed them clean before returning them to her shelf. A small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the man's character. The morning was spent in quiet industry. Nathaniel fixed the door hinge with a piece of metal he'd salvaged from somewhere, then built a proper woodpile against the south wall of the cabin. Daniel followed him like a shadow, occasionally bringing small sticks or stones when his father indicated a need. Ella sorted through her meager supplies, trying to plan how they would stretch through the winter ahead. As she worked, she found herself studying Nathaniel when he wasn't looking. The efficiency of his movements, the quiet authority he exuded, the gentle way he guided his son, despite the harshness of their circumstances. He was not what the townspeople called him, a savage, an animal. He was a man trying to protect his child in a world that saw them both as less than human. That evening, rain began to fall, pattering against the newly repaired roof. No leaks appeared. Ella lit the candle and placed it in the window, then opened the door. "You should come inside," she said to Nathaniel, who was preparing their usual spot beneath the overhang. "It's too cold out here for the boy." Nathaniel hesitated, looking at the rain, then at his son, who was already shivering. Finally, he nodded. They came in cautiously. Nathaniel positioned himself and Daniel near the door, their backs to the wall, as far from Ella's pallet as the small space allowed. He did not sleep, keeping watch through the night. But Daniel, wrapped in a blanket Ella had provided, slept deeply for the first time since they'd arrived. As the rain continued to fall, turning the world outside into a veil of silver, Ella felt something shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. A week passed, then another. The rhythm of their days began to take shape. Nathaniel rose before dawn, checking a series of snares he had set in the surrounding forest. He taught Daniel to help him clean and prepare whatever they caught. Rabbit, squirrel, occasionally a grouse. He brought back more than they needed, silently sharing the surplus with Ella. Ella tended to the small garden she had begun to reclaim from the weeds, digging up the last of the season's potatoes and carrots. Her body grew heavier with the child, making movement more difficult. Without being asked, Nathaniel fashioned a yoke from a piece of supple pine perfectly shaped to fit across her shoulders, distributing the weight of the water buckets she carried from the stream. It was a thing of practical beauty, sanded so smooth it felt like silk beneath her fingers. A gift that acknowledged her struggle without diminishing her strength. The nights grew colder. Though Nathaniel and Daniel now slept inside, he maintained a careful distance, always positioned between the door and his son, always watchful. Sometimes in the deepest part of the night, Ella would wake to find him sitting by the window, staring out at the stars, his profile etched against the darkness like a figure carved from stone. Daniel remained silent, but his eyes lost some of their haunted quality. He began to follow Ella as she worked in the garden, watching intently. One morning, he presented her with a smooth blue stone he had found by the stream. He placed it carefully on the doorstep and retreated quickly, but it was the first gesture of connection he had made. Ella kept the stone in her pocket, running her fingers over its cool surface when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. She still thought of Jacob daily, but the sharp pain of grief had begun to dull to a steady ache. She could remember him now with occasional moments of fondness rather than constant despair. She told Daniel stories sometimes about the brave miner who had once lived in these mountains, who had believed in treating all people with dignity. She wasn't sure the boy understood, but he would sit and listen, his eyes following her hands as she gestured. One rainy evening, as she prepared soup, a sharp knock at the door startled all of them. Nathaniel moved instantly to position himself between the door and Daniel, his body tense and ready. Ella opened the door to find Owen Miller, an old farmer who had been friends with Jacob. He was soaked through his weathered face, grave beneath his dripping hat. "Evening, Mrs. Harmon," he said, nodding respectfully. "Might I come in out of this deluge?" Ella stepped back, making room. "Of course, Mr. Miller." Owen's eyes widened at the sight of Nathaniel, but he recovered quickly, nodding to the taller man. "You must be the fellow from the auction. Heard about that." He removed his wet coat, hanging it near the door. "Name's Owen Miller. I worked the claim next to Jacob's before the company bought us all out." Nathaniel did not relax his stance, but he gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Owen accepted the cup of hot tea Ella offered, warming his gnarled hands around it. "Didn't just come for a social call, I'm afraid," he said, his voice lowering. "Thought you should know what's being said in town." Ella sat down heavily in the chair, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "Edgar," she said. It wasn't a question. Owen nodded grimly. "Him and the Reverend both. Armstrong's been preaching about the dangers of consorting with savages. Says it's the Christian duty of the town to intervene before—" He glanced at her swollen middle, "before the child comes." Nathaniel moved closer, his presence a silent bulwark at Ella's back. "What exactly are they planning?" he asked, his voice carrying the dangerous stillness of a mountain lake before a storm. Owen shook his head. "Nothing specific yet. But there's talk, ugly talk. Armstrong has a particular hatred for your kind, sir. Has ever since his first wife left him." "His wife?" Ella asked, surprised. "She was Miwok," Owen said. "Beautiful woman. He met her when he first came out west as a missionary. Married her thinking he was saving her. But, from what I heard, he was cruel to her. She ran back to her people after a year." He sipped his tea. "He's been poisoning the town against the natives, ever since claiming they bewitched her away from him." Nathaniel's face remained impassive, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. "There's something else," Owen continued. "Edgar's been telling folks you're not right in the head, Ella. Says grief has made you unstable, that you need guidance until the baby comes." And he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He's trying to make a case that he should be the child's guardian." Ella felt the blood drain from her face. "He can't. He has no right." "No, he doesn't," Owen agreed. "But he's got influence in town and with the company. And with you up here alone," he glanced at Nathaniel. "Well, with your situation as it is, some folks might be persuaded." The implications were clear. A widow living with a savage would be easy to paint as unstable, immoral, unfit to raise a child, especially a child who might have claim to the Harmon estate. Nathaniel's hand came to rest lightly on the back of Ella's chair, a gesture so subtle it might have been accidental, but she felt the intent behind its solidarity, protection. I have my husband's will, Ella said, though her voice lacked conviction. Everything he owned comes to me and the baby. Owen raised an eyebrow. You found it. Jacob told me he'd hidden it somewhere safe, but after the accident. Ella shook her head. No, but I know it exists. Jacob told me he'd made arrangements with a lawyer in Sacramento. Owen nodded slowly. That would explain why Edgar's in such a hurry. If that will surfaces before the baby comes, he stood reaching for his coat. I'll see what else I can find out. In the meantime, be careful. Both of you. As he turned to leave, Owen hesitated. One more thing. Edgar doesn't just hate Nathaniel here because of what he is. He hates him because of who he knows. His eyes locked with Nathaniel's. Jacob talked about you, you know. Never by name, but he mentioned a friend in the mountains. Said you'd shown him something special up there. A flicker of surprise crossed Nathaniel's face, quickly masked. Whatever it was, Owen continued, I reckon that's what Edgar's really after. The baby's just his excuse. He put on his hat. I'll come back when I learn more. After Owen left, silence filled the cabin. Ella stared into the fire, her thoughts racing. Edgar had always been cold to her, disapproving of Jacob's choice of bride, a shopkeeper's daughter from Sacramento with no family connections. But she had never imagined he would go so far as to try to take her child. He won't touch your baby, Nathaniel said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. His voice was soft, but carried the weight of an oath. I won't allow it. Ella looked up at him, surprised by the vehemence in his tone. Why are you helping me? She asked. I bought your freedom, but you don't owe me anything beyond that. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving to Daniel, who had fallen asleep by the fire. You gave up something precious to help strangers, he said finally. That deserves loyalty in return. It wasn't the whole answer she sensed, but it was all he was ready to give. For now, it was enough. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance, Ella woke to the sound of soft crying. She sat up, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Daniel was huddled in the corner, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Nathaniel was nowhere to be seen, likely checking the perimeter of the cabin, a habit he maintained despite the weather. Ella rose carefully and approached the boy, moving slowly to avoid startling him. Daniel, she whispered. He looked up, his face wet with tears, his eyes wide with some remembered horror. He shrank back as she drew near. It's all right, she said softly, kneeling beside him despite the discomfort of her pregnancy. You're safe here. Daniel shivered, his gaze darting to the window where lightning briefly illuminated the night. Understanding dawned on her. The storm had triggered some memory, some fear. Gently, she reached for the quilt on her pallet and wrapped it around his thin shoulders. I get scared sometimes, too, she confided, settling beside him against the wall. Especially during storms. Daniel didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. After a few minutes, his shivering subsided. Would you like to hear a story? She asked. My mother used to tell me stories during storms. Without waiting for a response, she began to speak, her voice low and soothing. She told him a simple tale about a brave rabbit who helped his forest friends prepare for winter. As she spoke, Daniel gradually relaxed, his eyelids growing heavy. By the time Nathaniel returned, shaking rain from his hair, Daniel had fallen asleep against Ella's side. Nathaniel paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Storm frightened him, Ella explained softly. Nathaniel nodded, a look of gratitude briefly crossing his features. He moved to lift Daniel, but Ella shook her head. Let him sleep, she whispered. He's peaceful now. Nathaniel hesitated, then settled on the floor nearby, his back against the wall, his gaze fixed on his son. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the cabin, a fragile peace had taken root. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Frost glittered on the fallen leaves around the cabin, and the distant peaks wore fresh caps of snow. Winter was approaching faster than usual, the old-timers in town would say. A hard winter coming. Ella woke stiff from sleeping against the wall, but Daniel was gone from her side. She found him outside with Nathaniel helping to stack firewood against the side of the cabin. The boy still didn't speak, but his movements were more purposeful than before, less haunted. As she prepared a simple breakfast, Ella's mind returned to Owen's visit and the warnings he had brought. Edgar was plotting something. The thought of him trying to take her baby made her physically ill. She rested her hand on her belly, feeling the child move within her. "I won't let him," she whispered to her unborn baby. "I promise." She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Nathaniel enter until he placed a freshly caught rabbit on the table. She jumped, startled. "Sorry," he said, his expression softening slightly. "Didn't mean to frighten you." "You didn't," she lied, trying to calm her racing heart. "Just thinking about what Mr. Miller said." Nathaniel nodded, his face growing serious. "We should prepare," he said, "not just for winter." "How?" she asked, the hopelessness of their situation washing over her. "Edgar has money, influence, the law on his side." "Law?" Nathaniel repeated, a bitter edge to his voice. "White man's law has never protected my people." He looked at her directly. "But there are other ways to fight." The intensity in his gaze made something flutter in her chest. Not fear, but a kind of recognition. They were both outsiders now, both fighting for their children, against a world that would take them away. Before he could elaborate, Daniel appeared in the doorway, holding something in his small hand. He approached Ella hesitantly, then held out his offering, a perfect pine cone, its scales open like a wooden flower. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful." The boy didn't smile, but something in his eyes lightened. He returned to his father's side, pressing against his leg. Nathaniel rested his hand on his son's head, a tender gesture at odds with his fierce appearance. "We'll need more wood," he said. "And I need to hunt larger game before the snow comes." He met Ella's gaze. "Will you be all right here alone for a day?" The question surprised her. It was the first time he'd asked about her preferences rather than simply acting. "Yes," she said. "But be careful. If Edgar or the Reverend's men are watching, they won't see me," Nathaniel said with quiet confidence. "I know these mountains better than they ever will." After they left, Ella spent the morning cleaning the cabin and taking stock of their supplies. The garden had yielded a modest harvest, and Nathaniel's hunting had provided meat they could smoke and preserve. But it wouldn't be enough to see them through a hard winter. They needed more of everything: food, firewood, medicines. As she worked, she found herself thinking of the cabin not as her temporary refuge, but as their home. The thought stopped her cold. When had she begun to think of Nathaniel and Daniel as permanent parts of her life, rather than chance companions? She was sweeping the floor when her broom hit a loose board, causing it to shift. Kneeling awkwardly, she examined the board and found it could be lifted away entirely. Beneath it was a small space dug into the earth, a hiding place. Her heart quickened. Jacob had mentioned that the hunting cabin had a secret compartment, a place his grandfather had used to hide valuables from bandits. She had forgotten about it until now. Reaching into the dark space, her fingers touched leather. She drew out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a book bound in worn leather, Jacob's journal. Beside it lay a folded paper and an old revolver. Her hands trembled as she opened the journal. Jacob's familiar handwriting filled the pages, entries dating back over a year. She turned to the final pages written just days before his death. "He followed us again today," Jacob had written. "I'm certain of it now. He suspects something, but he doesn't know what. N says we must be more careful, that there are those who would kill for what we've found. I fear my brother's greed has no limits. The equipment failures at the mine are becoming too frequent to be coincidence. I've written to Simmons in Sacramento about my suspicions, but the mail is slow. If anything happens to me, E must not be allowed to find the claim. N will protect it until my child is old enough to understand its true value." Ella read the entry 3 times, her blood turning to ice. Equipment failures. Suspicions. Jacob had thought Edgar was tampering with the mining equipment. Could he have been responsible for the accident that took her husband's life? The paper beside the journal was a map carefully drawn and annotated in Jacob's hand. It showed a section of the mountains northeast of the cabin with an X marked in a small valley. Below the X, Jacob had written, "The Eagle's Nest, richest vein in the Sierra, to be shared equally with N and his people, as agreed." N had to be Nathaniel. Jacob had not only known him, but had made some arrangement with him regarding a gold claim, a rich one from the sound of it. The realization staggered her. Jacob, always so honest, so open, had kept this secret from her. Yet he had planned for her and their child to benefit from it. The revolver was Jacob's old Army Colt, the one he'd carried during his brief service in the final days of the Civil War. It was loaded, the metal oiled and well-maintained, despite being hidden away. Ella sat back, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd found. Jacob hadn't died in a random accident. He had been murdered. And Edgar, the man who now sought to take her child, was almost certainly the murderer. She was still sitting there, the journal in her lap, when the first scream split the afternoon quiet. High and thin it came from the direction of the stream. A child's scream. Daniel. Ella struggled to her feet, grabbing the revolver from the hiding place. She moved as quickly as her pregnant body would allow, heart pounding with fear. She burst out of the cabin to see Daniel running from the stream, his face contorted in terror. Behind him, moving with deliberate slowness, came a mountain lion, tawny and massive, its tail lashing as it stalked its prey. "Daniel!" she cried. "Come to me!" The boy changed direction, sprinting toward her voice. The mountain lion paused, assessing this new development, then continued its pursuit. Ella raised the revolver, but her hands were shaking too badly to aim. If she missed, the beast would be on Daniel in seconds. "Here!" she shouted at the mountain lion, trying to distract it. "Over here." The cat's head swiveled toward her, its amber eyes fixing on this new threat. It hesitated, caught between 2 potential victims. In that moment of uncertainty, a figure emerged from the trees at a dead run. Nathaniel covering ground, with impossible speed, a hunting knife in his hand. He reached Daniel just as the mountain lion decided to resume its original pursuit. With one fluid motion, Nathaniel scooped his son into his arms and spun to face the predator, his knife held ready. The mountain lion launched itself in a powerful leap. Ella's finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire an arrow, whistled through the air, striking the cat in mid-leap. It fell to the ground, thrashing in pain and surprise. A second arrow followed the first, and the mountain lion went still. From the edge of the clearing stepped a woman Ella had never seen before. She was dressed in buckskins, her long black hair braided with leather thongs. She held a bow with another arrow nocked and ready, her dark eyes scanning the area for further threats. Nathaniel stared at the woman, his face a mask of shock. "Willow," he whispered. The woman lowered her bow, her expression a mirror of his surprise. "Nathaniel," she said, "we thought you were dead." Daniel squirmed in his father's arms, his face alight with recognition. And then, to Ella's astonishment, the boy spoke a torrent of words in a language she didn't understand, his voice high and excited as he pointed to the woman. Willow smiled, responding in the same language Miwok Ella realized. She approached and touched Daniel's cheek with gentle fingers, then looked at Nathaniel with questions in her eyes. "This is Willow's son on water," Nathaniel said to Ella, his voice strained with emotion. "My wife's sister." "Your wife?" Willow asked in accented English, her eyes darting between Nathaniel and Ella. "But Rebecca, we found her body after the attack." "Rebecca is dead," Nathaniel confirmed, his voice tight. "Murdered by white men searching for gold." He set Daniel down but kept him close. "We escaped, hid in the high country, until we were caught." His gaze returned to Ella. "This woman bought our freedom." Willow's expression changed, wariness replacing surprise. "Why would a white woman do this?" Before Ella could answer, Daniel spoke again, this time in halting English. "Mama Ella, good," he said. "She helps." Ella felt tears spring to her eyes at hearing the boy's voice for the first time, at being called Mama Ella. She took a step forward, then swayed as a wave of dizziness swept over her. Nathaniel moved quickly to steady her concern, evident in his face. "You should sit," he said, guiding her to a fallen log. Willow watched this interaction with sharp eyes. "You're with child," she observed. "Near your time." Ella nodded, one hand pressed to her belly. 2 months more, I think." "The father?" Willow asked bluntly. "Dead," Ella replied, matching her directness. "Murdered, I believe, by the same man who now wants to take my baby." Understanding passed between the two women, a recognition of shared vulnerability in a man's world. Willow nodded once, then moved to the mountain lion. With practiced efficiency, she began to clean the kill waste. "Nothing. She and others survived the attack on their village," Nathaniel explained quietly to Ella. "They've been living in the high valleys, hidden from the mining companies." His voice held a mixture of relief and pain. "I thought they were all dead." "She's your family," Ella said. "You should go with her. You and Daniel would be safer." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "We made a promise," he said finally, "to protect you and your child." He glanced at the revolver still clutched in her hand. "And it seems you have discoveries to share as well." Ella nodded, thinking of the journal hidden beneath the cabin floor. "Yes," she said. "I think I know why my husband died, and why Edgar is so determined to claim my baby." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, the four of them returned to the cabin. Willow brought the mountain lion meat, a valuable addition to their winter stores. Daniel walked between his father and his newfound aunt, speaking more freely than Ella had ever heard, switching between English and Miwok with childish ease. Watching them, Ella felt both hope and apprehension. Their small group had grown stronger with Willow's arrival, but Edgar's threat loomed larger now that she understood his true motives. The gold claim was valuable enough to kill, for he had already proven that. And as the winter snows began to close, the mountain passes trapping them all together until spring, she knew that a final confrontation was inevitable. That night, as Nathaniel spoke in low tones with Willow by the fire, sharing news and making plans, Ella reread Jacob's journal by candlelight. The words seemed to rise from the page, her husband's voice echoing in her mind. "N says the gold belongs to the mountain," Jacob had written. "That taking it all would be a desecration. I agree. We'll take only what we need, leave the rest for future generations." E would never understand such restraint. His hunger is bottomless. Ella closed the journal, her resolve hardening. Edgar had taken so much already, her home, her security, her husband. He would not take her child. He would not take this land. Whatever came with the winter, she would be ready. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow. The first flakes began to fall delicate and silent, covering the world in a blanket of white. Winter had arrived in the Sierra, bringing with it both sanctuary and siege. The first real snowfall came 3 days after Willow's arrival, great silent flakes that transformed the world overnight. Ella woke to find the cabin surrounded by a landscape of pristine white. The trees bowed under their new burdens, the stream partially frozen along its edges. The world had been rewritten in a language of white and shadow. She built up the fire, moving carefully to avoid waking Daniel, who slept curled on a pallet near the hearth. The boy had begun to speak more freely since his aunt's appearance, though still only in short, hesitant sentences when addressing Ella. It was as if a dam had broken inside him, releasing not just words but also fragments of his former self. Outside, Nathaniel and Willow were already awake, their voices a low murmur as they spoke in their native tongue. Through the frosted window, Ella could see them examining the perimeter of the clearing, discussing something with intense focus. They moved differently in each other's presence, more relaxed, more themselves. Family. A pang of loneliness struck her unexpectedly. She missed having someone who knew her history, her language, her ways, without explanation. She rested her hand on her swollen belly, feeling the child stir within. Soon she would not be entirely alone. The door opened, bringing a swirl of cold air and snowflakes. Nathaniel entered, stamping snow from his boots. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, his breath forming clouds in the chill cabin air. "Storms passed," he said, "but there's more coming. Big one." He nodded toward the journal that lay on the table where Ella had left it. "We should talk about that." Ella glanced at Daniel, still sleeping peacefully. "Yes," she agreed. "We should." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and joined Nathaniel at the table. He sat across from her, his large hands resting before him, fingers slightly curled, as if ready to grasp something, ready to act. "Jacob knew you well," she began. Nathaniel nodded once. "2 summers ago. He was lost in the mountains. I found him, guided him back." His eyes met hers directly. "He was different from other white men. He listened. He respected our ways. And he found gold," Ella said. "We found it together," Nathaniel corrected, "in a place my people considered sacred, Eagle's Nest Valley." His voice took on a different quality when he spoke, the name reverence mixed with caution. "The old ones said the mountain's heart lay there, that to take too much would bring destruction." Ella thought of the map hidden beneath the floorboards. "Jacob wrote that you made an agreement to share the claim." "Not to share," Nathaniel said. "To protect. To take only what was needed, no more. To keep it from those who would tear open the mountain for greed." His jaw tightened. "Men like your brother-in-law." "Edgar isn't actually Jacob's brother," Ella said, remembering what she had read. "They shared a father but not a mother. And according to the will, Jacob mentioned only a true blood, Harmon, can inherit the family holdings." Understanding dawned in Nathaniel's eyes. "The child you carry." She nodded, one hand protectively covering her belly. "Edgar took everything when Jacob died, the house, the land, the mining shares. He claimed there was no will. I was too grief-stricken to fight him then." Her voice hardened. "But he knows a child of Jacob's blood would have a legitimate claim. And now he seeks to control both the child and the gold," Nathaniel said, "by declaring you unfit." Yes. The single word hung between them heavy with implication. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his gaze turning to the window, where Willow could be seen checking snares at the edge of the clearing. "There is something else you should know," he said finally, his voice lowering, "about the attack on our village, about your husband's death." Ella tensed, sensing the weight of his words before he spoke them. "The men who came to our village were hired by a mining company," Nathaniel said. "They claimed we were on their land, but it was a lie. They wanted access to our hunting grounds because they suspected gold was there." His eyes darkened with memory. "They killed many. My wife, Daniel, saw it happen. That's why he stopped speaking." He reached into his shirt and withdrew a small leather pouch suspended from a cord around his neck. Opening it carefully, he removed something and placed it on the table between them. It was a gold watch, tarnished and dented, its crystal face cracked. Ella recognized it immediately, the company timepiece given to Edgar when he became foreman at the Golden Sierra mine. "I took this from the man who led them," Nathaniel said quietly. "He dropped it when they set fire to our lodge. I kept it as proof." Ella stared at the watch, nausea rising in her throat. "Edgar," she whispered. "He led the attack on your village." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "Your husband learned of it later. He came to warn us that his brother was planning something worse. That's when we decided to hide the gold claim to protect it until it could be properly shared, according to our agreement." His hand closed over the watch. "Jacob was a good man. He tried to stop Edgar, and I believe it cost him his life." Ella felt as if the cabin were spinning around her. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "How can you be certain?" "Daniel recognized him at the auction," Nathaniel said. "He has never forgotten the man with the red beard and cold eyes. The man who ordered our lodge burned with my wife still inside." His voice remained level, but a muscle worked in his jaw. "I recognized him too." A soft sound from the hearth made them both turn. Daniel was awake, sitting up on his pallet, watching them with solemn eyes. "Bad man," he said clearly. "Red-beard man, hurt mama." Ella felt her heart break for the child, for the horrors he had witnessed. She thought of Edgar standing in the auction square, laughing as Nathaniel and his son were displayed like animals. She thought of Jacob trusting his half-brother, even as Edgar plotted his death. "We need to find the will," she said, a new determination entering her voice. "And we need to be ready when Edgar comes. Because he will come once he realizes the snow has closed the high passes. He'll know we're trapped here until spring." Nathaniel nodded, his expression grim. "Willow says there are others, survivors from our village who would help us, but they're scattered in the high country, hidden." He glanced at Daniel. "And the snow makes travel dangerous." As if in answer to his words, the cabin door opened again, and Willow entered in a flurry of snowflakes. Her dark eyes moved from Nathaniel to Ella, noting the watch on the table, the tension in the air. "You've told her," she said in English. "It wasn't a question." Nathaniel nodded. Willow approached the table, her movements graceful despite the heavy buckskins she wore. "I've seen fresh tracks," she said. "Not animal. Men. 3, maybe 4, circling the cabin from the ridge." Ella's blood ran cold. "Edgar?" "No," Willow said, shaking her head. "These men move differently. Hunters, but not good ones. They left signs." She looked at Nathaniel. "White men don't know how to move in snow." "Reverend Armstrong's men most likely," Nathaniel said, watching, reporting back. "We should leave," Willow urged. "Now, while the storm has paused. There are caves in the high country where we would be safe until spring." Nathaniel glanced at Ella, his eyes dropping to her belly. She can't make that journey. Not now. Willow's expression hardened. Then she dooms us all. They will come with guns and fire just as before. No, Ella said, firmly standing despite the ache in her back. This is different. We have warning this time, and we have Jacob's journal, proof of what Edgar has done. She met Willow's gaze without flinching. I understand your fear, but running isn't the answer. Not this time. A tense silence filled the cabin. Daniel moved to stand beside his father, his small hand clutching Nathaniel's trouser leg. The boy looked from Willow to Ella, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. Ella is right. Running would only delay what must be faced. He placed his hand gently on Daniel's head. And I made a promise to protect them. I will keep it. Willow's shoulders stiffened, but after a moment, she gave a short nod. Then we prepare, and if they come with fire, we will answer with the winter's fury. She turned to Ella. You should know how to use that. She gestured to the revolver that now sat on the shelf near the door. Ella thought of Jacob showing her how to load and fire the old army Colt years ago, a skill she had never imagined needing. I know enough, she said, but I could learn more. Outside, the snow began to fall again, heavier now, driven by a rising wind. The brief reprieve was ending. The real storm was yet to come. In the days that followed, the cabin became a center of quiet, determined preparation. Nathaniel reinforced the door with a heavy wooden bar and shuttered the window against both weather and watching eyes. Willow set cleverly disguised traps along the likely approaches not designed to kill, but to warn of intruders. She also showed Ella how to use the plants she had gathered to make poultices for wounds and teas for strength. Daniel, sensing the seriousness of their situation, helped in his own way. He sorted dried herbs for Willow, carried firewood for his father, and began to speak more to Ella, asking questions about the baby and telling her fragmented stories about his mother. She sang, he told Ella one evening as they sorted pine nuts by the fire. When snow came, special song. Ella smiled, imagining this quiet boy in happier times. That's a beautiful memory to keep, she said. What was her name? Rebecca. Daniel said the word soft with reverence. Papa called her Becca. Nathaniel, sharpening his knife by the window, looked up at the sound of his wife's name. His expression was one of surprise, then a deep, complicated pain. It was the first time he had heard his son speak of his mother since her death. Ella saw the moment and understood its significance. Healing had begun for Daniel, fragile and tentative, but real. She wondered if such healing was possible for Nathaniel or for herself. That night, as Daniel slept, and Willow kept watch outside, Ella found Nathaniel sitting alone by the dying fire. His face, in the amber light, was a study in shadow and angles remote as the mountains themselves. He's remembering her, Ella said softly, lowering herself carefully onto the bench beside him. That's good. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes on the flames. I feared he would forget. He was so young. His hand moved to the leather pouch at his neck. I keep nothing of her but this. He opened the pouch and tipped something into his palm, a small wooden carving of an eagle worn smooth by handling. She made this for me when we were first together, he said. Said the eagle would guide me home if I was ever lost. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She was the one who found me, though. I was the lost one. How did you meet? Ella asked, sensing that he needed to speak of her to make Rebecca real in words as she had been in life. I was guiding for the army, Nathaniel said. Scouts. They valued my tracking skills but treated me as less than a man. One night in a border town, some soldiers decided to teach me my place. His hand tightened around the carving. They would have killed me, but Rebecca intervened. She worked at the trading post, knew some of the officers' wives. She shamed the soldiers into leaving. His voice took on a different quality, warmer, as if the memory itself provided comfort. She took me to her father's house, tended my wounds. Her father was a medicine man, respected in the village. He didn't approve of me at first. I was half white, had worked for the army. But Rebecca, he shook his head slightly. She was stubborn, said the Great Spirit had led her to me for a reason. You loved her very much, Ella said, not a question, but an acknowledgement. She was my heart, Nathaniel replied simply. He closed his hand around the carving, then carefully returned it to the pouch. When they killed her, I wanted to die too, but Daniel needed me. He looked toward the corner where his son slept. So I learned to live without a heart. The raw honesty of his words struck Ella deeply. She thought of the months after Jacob's death, how she had moved through each day like a ghost, her grief a physical weight that made even breathing an effort. Only the child growing within her had anchored her to life. I understand, she said, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. Sometimes surviving feels like a betrayal of those we've lost. Nathaniel turned to look at her fully, then really seeing her perhaps for the first time. Yes, he said, exactly that. A moment of perfect understanding passed between them, more intimate than any touch. Two broken souls recognizing their shared fracture lines. The moment was interrupted by a sharp whistle from outside, Willow's warning signal. Nathaniel was on his feet, instantly reaching for his knife. Stay with Daniel, he said, his voice shifting back to its usual guarded tone. Bolt the door behind me. He slipped out into the night, a shadow among shadows. Ella moved to the door and slid the heavy bar into place, then took the revolver from its shelf. She checked that it was loaded the way Jacob had taught her, then positioned herself where she could see both the door and Daniel. Minutes stretched like hours in the silence. The fire popped and hissed. Daniel stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness. Finally, a soft knock. 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slower ones, the signal they had agreed upon. Ella removed the bar and opened the door. Nathaniel entered, followed by Willow, and to Ella's surprise, Owen Miller. The old farmer was covered in snow, his face red with cold beneath his frost-coated beard. "Mr. Miller!" Ella exclaimed, helping the older man to a chair near the fire. "What are you doing out in this weather?" Owen rubbed his gnarled hands together, holding them toward the flames. "Had to warn you," he said, his breath still coming in gasps. "Edgar's on the move, him and Armstrong both." Ella felt her heart sink. "Tell me," she said, pouring the old man a cup of hot tea from the kettle that hung by the fire. Owen accepted the tea gratefully, taking a long sip before speaking. "Armstrong's been preaching hellfire about the widow who consorts with savages. Got half the town believing you're possessed by the devil." He shook his head in disgust. "But that's just the cover. The real plan is Edgar's." "What is he planning?" Nathaniel asked, standing by the window where he could keep watch. "He's filed papers with the county court," Owen said grimly, "claiming you're mentally unstable, Ella. That grief has affected your judgment. He's seeking emergency guardianship of your child when it's born." He took another sip of tea. "Judge Wilson is in Edgar's pocket, takes donations from the mining company. He'll grant it." Ella's hand went protectively to her belly. "He can't just take my baby." "He can, if the law says you're unfit," Owen replied. "And with you living up here alone, Well, from their perspective with savages, he nodded apologetically to Nathaniel and Willow. That's all the proof they need. When? Willow asked, her dark eyes intent. When do they come? That's why I risked the trip tonight, Owen said. They're gathering a posse, plan to leave at first light before the next storm hits. About a dozen men, Edgar and Armstrong leading them. They're bringing the doctor, too. Figure the journey might start your labor. His weathered face creased with concern. They mean to take you back to town, Ella. By force, if necessary. And Nathaniel and Daniel? Ella asked, though she already knew the answer. Owen's silence was reply enough. Willow spat a word in her native tongue that needed no translation. We fight, she said, or we leave. Now. Owen shook his head. The pass is already dangerous. Be suicide to try it tonight especially. He glanced at Ella's condition. And they've sent men to watch the main trails. You'd be seen. There is another way, Nathaniel said quietly. All eyes turned to him. A path few know. Through Eagle's Nest Valley. Owen's eyebrows rose. The Sacred Valley, I thought your people kept that secret. They do, Willow said sharply, glaring at Nathaniel. It is forbidden to bring outsiders there. These are not ordinary circumstances, Nathaniel replied, meeting her gaze steadily. And Jacob was there before. He respected our ways. A silent communication passed between them, some tribal understanding Ella couldn't interpret. Finally, Willow gave a reluctant nod. It might work, Nathaniel continued, turning back to the others. But not tonight. We need daylight for the first part of the journey, and Ella needs rest before attempting it. Then, we have until dawn, Owen said. I can return to town, try to delay them. Tell them I saw lights higher up the mountain, that you've moved to another cabin. No, Ella said firmly. You've risked enough, Mr. Miller. If they suspect you've warned us, they'll consider you an accomplice. She looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight. The old farmer who had been her husband's friend, the native woman who had lost her sister to white men's violence, the silent boy sleeping in the corner, and Nathaniel, whose eyes held both determination and something deeper, something she was afraid to name. We'll face them here, she decided, on our terms, with the evidence we have. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. We have the high ground, he said, and they won't expect resistance. There's something else you should know, Owen said, setting down his empty cup. Edgar's been drinking heavily, talking wild when he thinks no one's listening. Last night at the Broken Pick he was ranting about gold and how Jacob had stolen his birthright. The old man's eyes narrowed. He said something about finishing what was started at the native camp. That mean anything to you? Nathaniel and Willow exchanged a dark look. It means he led the attack that killed my wife, Nathaniel said, his voice dangerously quiet. And that he murdered Jacob to keep it secret. Owen's weathered face paled. My God, he whispered. I feared something wasn't right about Jacob's death. But this... He shook his head. The equipment failure that killed him. I never believed it was an accident. Jacob was too careful. We have proof, Ella said. Jacob's journal. He suspected Edgar was tampering with the equipment, wrote it all down. That journal would be worth a lot in court, Owen said, if you can get it there. First, we have to survive until morning, Willow pointed out pragmatically. They spent the next hour planning. The cabin's position on a slight rise gave them some advantage. The single approach through the clearing would force Edgar's men to expose themselves. Willow knew how to use the snow itself as a weapon, creating traps and blind spots. Owen, despite Ella's protests, insisted on staying. I'm too old to make it back down the mountain tonight anyway, he said, and I owe it to Jacob to see this through. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they took their positions. Owen remained inside with Daniel, and the revolver instructed to keep the boy safe above all else. Willow concealed herself in the trees to the west of the clearing, her bow ready. Nathaniel and Ella waited on the cabin's small porch, presenting a united front. The storm had passed during the night, leaving a world transformed. The snow lay deep and unmarked across the clearing, glittering in the early light. The sky was clear, a pale, perfect blue that promised bitter cold. Their breath formed clouds in the still air as they waited. "Are you afraid?" Nathaniel asked quietly, his eyes on the tree line. Ella considered the question. "Yes," she admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing." Her hand rested on her belly. "Of failing Jacob, of failing our child." Nathaniel nodded, understanding. "When I was a boy, my father told me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it." He glanced at her. "You have courage, Ella Harmon, more than many warriors I've known." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "So do you," she replied, "staying to protect us when you could have escaped with Daniel." "I made a promise," he said simply, but his eyes, when they met hers, held something that went beyond obligation. The moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats, muffled by snow, but growing steadily louder. "They come," Nathaniel said, straightening to his full height. Ella drew a deep breath, steadying herself. The child within her kicked vigorously, as if sensing her tension. "Whatever happens," she said, "thank you for everything." Nathaniel's hand briefly covered hers where it rested on the porch railing. "We will prevail," he said, not as a hope, but as a statement of fact. The first riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, Edgar leading his red beard vivid against the white landscape. Beside him rode Reverend Armstrong, his black coat and hat making him look like a crow against the snow. Behind them came 10 more men, including a slight figure Ella recognized as Dr. Winters, the town physician. They halted at the clearing's edge, clearly surprised to see Ella and Nathaniel waiting for them. Edgar recovered first, a false smile spreading beneath his beard. "Ella, my dear sister," he called, "we've come to bring you home where you belong." His tone was honey over poison, concerned for the benefit of his companions. "This is my home," Ella replied, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "And you are not welcome here, Edgar." Edgar's smile faltered. "Now, Ella, be reasonable. It's not safe for you up here in your condition. The Reverend and I are concerned for your welfare. And the welfare of your unborn child," Armstrong added, his thin face set in righteous lines. "A child who deserves a Christian upbringing, not to be raised among heathens." Nathaniel remained silent beside her, his presence a solid counterweight to her nervousness. "My child will be raised as its father wished," Ella said, according to the terms of his will. A flicker of alarm crossed Edgar's face. "What will Jacob left no will?" "He did," Ella countered, "and it names me as sole heir to all Harmon properties with provisions for our child." This was a bluff. She hadn't found the actual will, only Jacob's mention of it, but Edgar's reaction confirmed her suspicions. "You're confused, Ella," Edgar said, his voice hardening. "Grief has affected your mind. Dr. Winters has agreed to examine you." He gestured to the physician, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "For your own good." "I'm perfectly sane," Ella replied. "Sane enough to understand why you're really here, Edgar. It's not concern for me or my child. It's fear." Edgar's expression darkened. "Fear of what?" "Of what Jacob knew," Ella said, her voice gaining strength. "About what happened at the Miwok camp 3 years ago. about how my husband really died." A murmur ran through the gathered men. Armstrong shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Careful, Ella," Edgar warned, his hand moving to rest on the pistol at his hip. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," she replied. Jacob kept a journal. He wrote down everything: his suspicions about the equipment failures at the mine, his knowledge of your attack on the native village. He knew what you were capable of, Edgar. Edgar's face had gone pale beneath his beard. "She's raving," he said to the men behind him. "You see how unstable she is." But doubt had begun to show on some faces. These were men who had worked with Jacob, who had respected him. "Let me see this supposed journal," Armstrong demanded. "I have it safe," Ella said, "along with other evidence." She glanced meaningfully at Nathaniel, who stood impassive beside her. Edgar's control began to slip. "This is absurd. Are you going to believe the ravings of a woman consorting with savages over a respected member of the community?" "Why don't we ask him?" Ella suggested, nodding toward the trees to their left. All heads turned to see Willow emerge from the forest, her bow drawn and aimed steadily at Edgar. Beside her walked a figure that made Edgar's face drain of all color. Owen Miller, holding Jacob's journal open in his hands. "I've been reading some interesting passages, boys," Owen called, "about how our mine foreman might have been tampering with safety equipment, about how he led an attack on a peaceful native settlement." He turned a page demonstratively. Jacob was mighty thorough in his observations. "Miller, you old fool," Edgar snarled. "You're believing the word of a half-breed and a woman over the man who cheated his own brother." Owen interrupted. "The man who's been trying to steal his brother's widow's child. I think I know whose word to trust." And the men behind Edgar were now openly murmuring, exchanging uncertain glances. Dr. Winters edged his horse backward, clearly wanting no part of what was unfolding. Armstrong, sensing the shift in mood, attempted to regain control. "Brothers," he intoned, "let us not be deceived by these fabrications. We came here on a mission of Christian mercy. Like the mercy you showed your Miwok wife, Reverend." Nathaniel spoke for the first time, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "The woman you beat until she fled back to her people." Armstrong's face contorted with shock and rage. "How dare you? That's a vicious lie." "Is it?" Willow called. "My cousin served in your house, Reverend. She saw the bruises. She heard your wife's cries." A new murmur went through the posse, this one edged with disgust. Armstrong's reputation in town had been built on his piety and moral authority. If that was undermined, Edgar, seeing his support crumbling, made a desperate move. He drew his pistol and aimed it directly at Ella. "Enough of this farce," he growled. "Ella, you're coming with us now. The rest of these savages can die here." Nathaniel stepped in front of Ella protectively, but she moved to stand beside him. "No, Edgar," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's over. These men now know what you are, what you've done." "You have nothing," Edgar shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "A journal, the word of savages who will believe you over me." "I will," came a new voice from the cabin doorway. All eyes turned to see Daniel standing there, his small figure framed by the rough timber. He pointed directly at Edgar, his young face set in lines of determination. "You killed my mother," he said clearly, his high voice carrying across the suddenly silent clearing. "You gave the order. You watched her burn. I remember your eyes, your red beard. I remember everything." Edgar's face twisted with rage. "Shut up, you little savage!" He swung his pistol toward Daniel. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Nathaniel launched himself from the porch, moving faster than seemed possible in the deep snow. Willow's bowstring sang her arrow, finding its mark in Edgar's shoulder. Edgar screamed in pain but still managed to fire his pistol. The shot went wide, splintering the cabin's door frame. Nathaniel reached Edgar's horse and dragged him from the saddle, both men crashing into the snow. Chaos erupted. Some men drew weapons while others backed away. Armstrong was shouting something about demons and hellfire. Dr. Winters had turned his horse and was already fleeing back down the trail. Ella ran to Daniel, shielding him with her body as she pulled him back into the cabin. Owen hurried to join them, still clutching the journal. Through the window they watched as Nathaniel and Edgar fought in the snow. Nathaniel's greater strength against Edgar's desperate fury. Blood from his arrow wound stained the white ground beneath them. Edgar still had his pistol, trying to aim it at Nathaniel's head, even as the larger man gripped his wrist. The gun discharged again, the sound flatter in the open air. For a terrible moment, Ella thought Nathaniel had been hit. But it was Edgar who suddenly went limp, his eyes wide with shock. The bullet had ricocheted off a rock hidden beneath the snow and found its way back to its owner. The clearing fell silent, except for the harsh sound of Nathaniel's breathing as he stood, leaving Edgar motionless in the blood-stained snow. The remaining men of the posse looked on in horror. Armstrong, his moral authority shattered, could only stare. Into this frozen tableau rode a new figure, Sheriff Thomas Durant, followed by 3 deputies. The sheriff took in the scene with professional detachment. "Seems I missed the excitement," he said dryly. "Anyone care to tell me what happened here?" Over the next hour, the story emerged from multiple perspectives. Owen showed the sheriff Jacob's journal. Nathaniel and Willow described the attack on their village. Daniel, his initial courage spent, spoke only briefly, confirming what he had witnessed. Ella explained Edgar's attempts to steal her inheritance and her child. Sheriff Durant, a taciturn man known for his fairness, listened to it all without comment. When they finished, he turned to Armstrong. "Reverend, I believe your presence is required back in town. There's a funeral to arrange." He nodded toward Edgar's body, now covered with a blanket and secured to a pack horse. Armstrong, pale and shaken, could only nod. His moral crusade had collapsed around him, exposing his own hypocrisy. "As for the rest of you," Durant continued, addressing the remaining posse members, "I suggest you return to your homes and reflect on how easily you were led to participate in what appears to have been a criminal enterprise." His stern gaze swept over them. "I'll be taking statements from each of you in town." The men dispersed quickly, eager to distance themselves from what had transpired. Finally, Durant turned to Ella. "Mrs. Harmon, this journal is evidence in what's now a murder investigation, both your husband's death and the attack on the native settlement. I'll need to take it with me." Ella hesitated, then nodded. "On one condition, Sheriff, that you personally ensure it reaches Judge Wilson in Sacramento, along with a copy of Jacob's will when we find it." Durant considered this, then nodded. "That's fair. I've had my suspicions about Edgar Harmon for some time. Never could prove anything until now." As the sheriff prepared to leave, he paused beside Nathaniel. "The arrow was a clean shot," he said quietly. "And what happened after was clearly self-defense. There'll be no charges." He glanced at Willow, who stood protectively near Daniel. "Your people have seen little justice from mine. Perhaps this is a small step toward changing that." After the sheriff and his deputies had departed with Edgar's body, an exhausted silence fell over the cabin. The morning's confrontation had left them all drained. Daniel had fallen asleep against Willow's side. Owen dozed in the chair by the fire. Outside, the sky had clouded over again, promising more snow by nightfall. Ella stood by the window watching the last riders disappear down the trail. Her hand rested on her belly, where the child moved restlessly. "It's over," she said softly, as Nathaniel came to stand beside her. "I can hardly believe it." "Not entirely over," he replied. "There will still be those in town who believe Armstrong's version, and the will must still be found." "But Edgar can't hurt anyone anymore," she said. "Not you and Daniel, not my baby." She looked up at him. "What will you do now? Will you and Daniel go with Willow to rejoin your people?" Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the snowy landscape outside. "That was my first thought," he admitted. "To return to the mountains to live according to our ways." "It's what's best for Daniel," Ella said, though the words cost her. "To be among his mother's people, to learn their traditions." "Perhaps," Nathaniel agreed. "But Daniel has begun to heal here with you." He turned to look at her directly. "And I made a promise to Jacob to protect the gold claim until his child was old enough to understand its value." Ella felt a flicker of hope she dared not name. "You would stay, even after what my people have done to yours." "Not all your people," Nathaniel said. "Jacob was different. Owen is different." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "You are different, Ella Harmon." The way he said her name made something flutter within her that had nothing to do with the child she carried. "The snow will keep the passes closed until spring," she said. "You have time to decide." Nathaniel nodded, but his expression suggested the decision might already be made. A sudden cry from Daniel broke the moment. The boy was thrashing in his sleep, caught in the grip of a nightmare. Willow tried to soothe him, but he only grew more agitated. Ella moved to kneel beside him, her maternal instincts overriding the awkwardness of her pregnancy. "Daniel," she called softly. "Daniel, you're safe. It's just a dream." The boy's eyes flew open wild with remembered fear. When he saw Ella, he launched himself into her arms, burying his face against her shoulder. "Red-beard man," he sobbed, "coming to hurt us." "No, sweetheart," she murmured, stroking his hair. "The red-beard man is gone. He can't hurt anyone anymore." Daniel's sobs gradually subsided, but he maintained his grip on her. "Promise?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I promise," Ella said firmly. "You're safe now. We all are." Over Daniel's head, her eyes met Nathaniel's. He was watching them with an expression she had never seen before. A softening of his usual guarded features, a warmth that reached his eyes. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition of possibilities neither had allowed themselves to consider until now. Outside, the snow began to fall again, thick flakes swirling down to cover the trampled clearing, erasing the signs of conflict. By morning, it would be as if the confrontation had never happened. A clean slate. A new beginning. Ella held Daniel until he fell asleep again, then carefully laid him on his pallet by the fire. As she straightened, a sharp pain lanced through her lower back, causing her to gasp. Nathaniel was at her side instantly, his hand supporting her elbow. "What is it?" Ella breathed deeply until the pain subsided. "Nothing," she said. "Just a twinge. The baby's been active today." Willow approached her experienced eyes, assessing Ella's condition. "How often do these twinges come?" she asked directly. "They're not regular," Ella assured her. "I still have weeks to go." Willow looked skeptical, but didn't press the issue. "You should rest," she said instead. "It has been a difficult day." Ella couldn't argue with that. The emotional strain of the confrontation combined with the physical demands of her pregnancy had left her exhausted. She allowed Nathaniel to help her to her pallet, where she settled with a grateful sigh. as darkness fell outside, bringing with it a renewed intensity of snowfall. The cabin took on the feeling of a sanctuary. Owen stoked the fire to a cheerful blaze. Willow prepared a simple but nourishing stew from their stores. Daniel, recovered from his nightmare, helped lay out bowls and spoons with careful concentration. Nathaniel moved about the cabin with a new ease, as if some invisible burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Occasionally, his eyes would meet Ella's, and that same warmth would pass between them, unspoken but unmistakable. After they had eaten, Owen entertained them with stories of the early days in the Sierra, before the big mining companies had arrived. He spoke of Jacob as a young man full of dreams and principles, unwilling to compromise his beliefs, even when it would have been easier. "He would be proud of you, Ella," the old man said, "standing your ground today, protecting his child and his legacy." "He would be grateful to all of you," Ella replied. "I couldn't have faced Edgar alone." "You're not alone," Nathaniel said quietly. "Not anymore." The simple statement held the weight of a promise, one that brought unexpected tears to Ella's eyes. For the first time since Jacob's death, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, a comfortable silence settled over the cabin. Owen had fallen asleep in the chair, his soft snores barely audible above the crackling of the flames. Daniel lay curled on his pallet, one hand reaching out in sleep to touch Ella's quilt, as if reassuring himself of her presence. Willow had gone outside to check the perimeter one last time before resting. Nathaniel sat by the window, keeping watch, as was his habit. The firelight played across his strong features, softening the lines of hardship and grief that normally marked his face. Ella studied him from her pallet, seeing him with new eyes. Not as a savage, not as a protector, but as a man who had suffered greatly and still found the capacity for kindness, for loyalty, perhaps even for love. The thought should have frightened her, should have felt like a betrayal of Jacob. But instead, it settled in her heart like a seed planted in fertile soil, ready to grow when the season was right. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving the snow against the cabin in waves. But inside, warmth and the beginning of hope prevailed. Whatever challenges spring might bring, they would face them together. Ella closed her eyes, one hand resting protectively over her unborn child. For the first time in months, she slept without fear, without grief. And if she dreamed of a future where laughter filled the cabin and children, both hers and Nathaniel's, played in a garden reclaimed from wilderness, who could blame her? The gold in Eagle's Nest Valley would remain protected as Jacob and Nathaniel had intended. But the real treasure, Ella was beginning to understand, had nothing to do with metal gleaming in mountain streams. It was here in this cabin, in the fragile bonds forming between wounded souls who had found each other against all odds. As she drifted toward sleep, Ella remembered something her mother had often said: "Gold is where you find it, but home is what you make." With Nathaniel Daniel and her soon-to-be-born child, she was finally ready to make a home again. Morning came with the hushed stillness that follows heavy snowfall. Ella woke to find the cabin bathed in a pearly light that filtered through the frost-covered window. The events of the previous day seemed almost dreamlike in the quiet of dawn: Edgar's confrontation, his death, the sheriff's intervention. But the lingering soreness in her lower back reminded her it had all been real. She rose carefully, mindful of her ungainly body. The baby had been restless all night, turning and kicking, as if sensing the tension that still lingered in the air despite Edgar's demise. As she moved about the cabin preparing breakfast, she noted that Willow was already gone, likely checking her snares. Owen still slept in the chair by the fire, his weathered face relaxed in slumber. Daniel lay curled on his pallet, one small hand clutching the blue stone she had given him. There was no sign of Nathaniel. A flutter of worry passed through her, quickly dismissed. He wouldn't have left without saying goodbye, not after everything they'd shared. Still, she found herself moving to the window, searching the snowy clearing for any sign of him. Relief washed over her when she spotted him emerging from the tree line, carrying an armload of firewood. Snow dusted his shoulders and hair, glittering in the early light. He moved with purpose, but without his usual wariness, as if the weight of constant vigilance had eased somewhat. When he entered the cabin, their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the subtle shift in their relationship. Not quite trust, not quite friendship, but something moving in that direction. "Good morning," she said softly, mindful of the others still sleeping. "Morning," he replied, setting the wood beside the hearth. "Storms passed, left about 3 feet of new snow. Is the trail to town completely blocked?" He nodded. "For wagons and horses, yes. A man could make it on snowshoes, but it would be difficult." "Then we're truly isolated until the thaw," she said, surprised to find the thought didn't frighten her as it once might have. "Yes," Nathaniel studied her face. "Does that concern you?" "No," she answered honestly. "After yesterday, I'm grateful for the respite." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "As am I." He moved to help her with breakfast preparations, reaching for items on high shelves she could no longer access easily. They worked in companionable silence, their movements falling into an unconscious rhythm, she stirring the porridge, he adding wood to the fire. She setting out bowls, he fetching water from the bucket by the door. It was so domestic, so ordinary, that Ella found herself momentarily disoriented. How had they come to this place of quiet cooperation, this man who had been a stranger purchased with her wedding ring barely a month ago? The cabin door opened, admitting Willow along with a gust of cold air. She carried several snow hares already cleaned and ready for the pot. "Good hunting," Nathaniel observed in their native tongue. Willow nodded her dark eyes, taking in the scene before her. Ella and Nathaniel, working together in the small kitchen area, the domesticity of the moment. Something passed across her face, too quick to interpret. "The snow has covered all signs of yesterday's events," she said, switching to English. "But I found fresh tracks on the North Ridge. Someone watching the cabin." Nathaniel tensed immediately. "Edgar's men." "No," Willow replied. "Different. Careful tracks. Experienced in snow." She glanced at Owen, who was beginning to stir in his chair. "Not like these townsmen who crash through the forest like wounded bears." Owen yawned and stretched his stiff limbs. "I'll try not to take offense at that, ma'am," he said good-naturedly. Willow's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Offense was not intended, old one, merely observation." "Who would be watching us?" Ella asked, concerned, despite the relative safety they now enjoyed with Edgar gone. "Could be some of my people," Nathaniel suggested. "Survivors from the village who've heard of our presence here." "Or it could be Armstrong's followers," Owen countered, accepting the cup of coffee Ella handed him. "The Reverend lost face yesterday, but he still has influence in town. And he's never been one to surrender his grudges easily." The mention of Armstrong sobered them all. The Reverend's hatred of Native Americans was deeply personal, rooted in the perceived betrayal by his Miwok wife years ago. With Edgar dead, Armstrong might well redirect his vengeance toward Nathaniel and Willow. "I'll keep watch today," Nathaniel decided. "Whoever it is, we should know their intentions before they get too close." Daniel had awakened during their conversation and now sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Is the bad man coming back?" he asked, his voice small with renewed fear. Ella moved to sit beside him, stroking his hair reassuringly. No, sweetheart. The red-beard man is gone forever. But we still need to be careful of other people who might not understand our family. The word slipped out naturally, and only after she'd spoken did Ella realize its implications. She glanced up to find Nathaniel watching her, an unreadable expression in his eyes. Daniel seemed to accept her explanation, though, and leaned against her side with the easy trust of a child who has found safety after long fear. "I'm hungry," he announced. The simple statement, so normal and childlike, broke the tension. Ella laughed softly. "Then let's eat. Porridge is ready." They gathered around the table, an unlikely group brought together by circumstance, and shared danger: a pregnant widow, a half-Miwok woodsman, his traumatized son, a native woman warrior, and an elderly farmer. Yet, as they shared the simple meal, Ella was struck by how right it felt. How much like a family despite their differences. After breakfast, Owen announced his intention to return to town. "Sheriff Durant will need my statement about Edgar's actions," he explained. "And someone should keep an eye on Armstrong, see what he's planning." "It's dangerous," Ella protested. "You said yourself the trail is barely passable." "I've lived in these mountains for 40 years, my dear," Owen replied with a wink. "A little snow won't stop me. Besides, you need someone in town who can speak on your behalf, especially with the will still missing." Ella couldn't argue with his logic, though she worried for the old man's safety. "At least wait until tomorrow," she urged. "Give the sun time to settle the snow a bit." Owen agreed reluctantly. "One more day then, but I should make preparations." While Owen and Nathaniel discussed the best route back to town, considering the heavy snowfall, Ella busied herself with household tasks. The physical activity helped distract her from the persistent ache in her lower back, which had intensified since morning. Willow, observing her from across the cabin, finally approached. "You are having pains," she said bluntly. It wasn't a question. "Just discomfort," Ella replied, trying to sound unconcerned. "The baby is very active today." Willow's expression remained skeptical. "When is your child due?" "Not for at least 6 weeks," Ella said. "Probably longer." Willow studied her thoughtfully. "The first child often comes early, especially after great fear or excitement." A flicker of alarm passed through Ella. "You think the baby is coming now?" "That's not possible. It's too soon." Willow shrugged. "The child decides, not the mother." She placed a hand on Ella's belly, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Let me prepare some tea. It will help with the pain and make you stronger for what may come." Despite her concerns, Ella found herself trusting Willow's experience. The native woman had likely attended many births among her people. If the baby truly was coming early, Ella would need her knowledge. As the day progressed, the pains grew more distinct, coming at irregular intervals, but definitely intensifying. Ella tried to hide her discomfort, not wanting to alarm Daniel or distract Nathaniel from his vigilance, but by mid-afternoon, even Owen had noticed her difficulty. "Ella, my dear, you're white as a sheet," he said with grandfatherly concern. "Perhaps you should lie down for a while." She nodded, too exhausted to argue. As she made her way to her pallet, a particularly strong contraction seized her, forcing her to grip the table edge for support. A small gasp escaped her lips. Nathaniel was at her side instantly, his strong arm supporting her. "What is it? What's wrong?" "The baby," Willow answered for her, appearing at Ella's other side. "It comes, but it's too soon," Ella protested weakly, even as another wave of pain washed over her. "Not for this child," Willow said firmly. "Come, you must lie down now." With Nathaniel's help, she guided Ella to the pallet, arranging blankets and pillows to make her as comfortable as possible. Owen discreetly moved to the far side of the cabin, with Daniel engaging the boy in a game of checkers to distract him from Ella's increasing distress. "I'll go," Nathaniel said, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Give you privacy." Ella reached out and caught his hand, surprising herself with the gesture. "No," she said. "Please stay. I'm... I'm frightened." The admission cost her pride, but the fear was real. Jacob should have been here for this moment. She should have been in her own home with a midwife and female relatives to attend her. Instead, she faced childbirth in a remote cabin, with only a native woman she barely knew to help her. Nathaniel hesitated, then nodded, his expression softening. "I'll stay," he promised, squeezing her hand gently. As the afternoon deepened into evening, Ella's labor progressed. Willow proved to be a knowledgeable and efficient midwife, preparing herbal teas to ease the pain and positioning Ella to make the birth easier. She spoke soft instructions, her usual brusqueness replaced by a calm authority that Ella found reassuring. Nathaniel remained nearby, sometimes holding Ella's hand when the contractions were strongest, sometimes stepping away to check on Daniel or to ensure the cabin remained secure. His quiet presence gave Ella strength, reminding her that she was not alone in this ordeal. Outside, the early winter darkness had fallen. Owen kept the fire burning brightly, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin. Daniel had fallen asleep on his pallet, exhausted by the day's tension. As midnight approached, Ella's labor entered its final stage. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced, tearing through her body in waves that left her gasping and weak. Willow positioned herself at the foot of the pallet, issuing calm instructions. "Push now," she commanded. "The child is ready to meet its mother." Ella gathered her remaining strength and bore down, crying out, despite her determination to remain stoic. Nathaniel knelt beside her, his face a mask of concern and something deeper, a fierce protectiveness that gave her courage. "Once more," Willow urged. "I can see the head." With a final tremendous effort, Ella pushed, and suddenly the excruciating pressure released. A thin, indignant wail filled the cabin. "A daughter," Willow announced, lifting the tiny, red-faced infant. "Strong lungs, a fighter like her mother." Tears flooded Ella's eyes as Willow placed the swaddled newborn in her arms. Despite being early, the baby appeared healthy, small but perfectly formed, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that, when they briefly opened, were the deep blue of all newborns. "She's beautiful," Ella whispered, overcome with a love so powerful it made her previous fears seem insignificant. This was her daughter, hers and Jacob's, his final gift to her. She looked up to find Nathaniel watching them, his expression one of wonder and a strange, sad joy. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying, for everything." He nodded, unable to speak. His eyes moved from the baby to Ella's face, and in them she read a complex mixture of emotions, admiration, tenderness, and something else, something he wasn't ready to name. Willow busied herself with the practical aftermath of birth cleaning and preparing healing herbs. Owen approached cautiously, his weathered face breaking into a delighted smile when he saw the baby. "Jacob would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She has his look about her already." Ella nodded, too exhausted and overwhelmed to speak further. The baby had fallen asleep against her breast, tiny fingers curled into a perfect fist. "You should both rest now," Willow advised. "The child is strong but came early. She needs her mother's warmth and milk." Ella was only too happy to comply. The exertion of birth had left her completely drained. As she drifted toward sleep, cradling her daughter close, she was vaguely aware of Nathaniel placing another blanket over them both, his touch gentle as a whisper. Her last conscious thought was of Jacob. "I wish you could see her," she murmured to his memory. "She's perfect." Dawn broke clear and cold sunlight sparkling on the fresh snow outside the cabin. Ella woke to the soft sounds of her daughter's breathing and the quiet murmur of voices nearby. The birth seemed almost dreamlike now, though her body's soreness confirmed its reality. Nathaniel and Owen were speaking in low tones by the door, their serious expressions suggesting a matter of concern. Willow sat nearby, grinding herbs with focused precision. "What is it?" Ella asked, her voice still hoarse from the previous night's exertions. "What's wrong?" The men turned their conversation, halting abruptly. It was Owen who approached, his kind face troubled. "Nothing for you to worry about, my dear," he said, though his tone belied the reassurance. "Just discussing the best time for me to head back to town." Ella wasn't convinced. "There's something else," she insisted. "I can see it in your faces." Nathaniel and Owen exchanged glances. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. "Willow found more tracks this morning, closer to the cabin, and footprints near the woodpile. Someone has been here watching us." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran through Ella. She instinctively drew her daughter closer. "Armstrong." "Possible," Nathaniel acknowledged. "Or someone working for him. Either way, they know we're vulnerable." "Especially with the little one arrived," Owen added gently. "Makes it all the more important that I get back to town, speak with the sheriff." Ella nodded, recognizing the logic but hating the idea of Owen making the dangerous journey alone. "When will you go?" "Today," the old man replied firmly. "No sense in waiting. The weather's clear, and I can make good time if I leave soon." They spent the morning helping Owen prepare. Nathaniel fashioned a pair of crude snowshoes from branches and rawhide, while Willow packed provisions for the journey. Ella, still confined to her pallet, with the newborn, offered what advice she could about the trails and landmarks Owen would encounter. Daniel, fascinated by the baby, stayed close to Ella's side, watching the tiny girl with solemn wonder. "What's her name?" he asked, reaching out tentatively to touch her small hand. Ella realized she hadn't yet decided. In the chaos of recent events, naming the child had seemed a distant concern. Now, looking at her daughter's peaceful face, she considered carefully. "Hope," she decided. "Her name is Hope." Daniel nodded, apparently approving of the choice. "Hope," he repeated softly. "Like when the sun comes back after the long snow." "Exactly like that," Ella agreed, touched by the boy's perception. By mid-morning, Owen was ready to depart. He stood by the door, wrapped in his warmest clothes, the improvised snowshoes secured to his boots. "I should reach town by nightfall if all goes well," he said. "I'll speak with Durant immediately, then see about finding Jacob's lawyer in Sacramento." "Be careful," Ella urged. "If Armstrong's men are watching, don't you worry about me," Owen assured her with a wink. "I may be old, but I'm crafty. They won't even know I've passed." He bent to kiss Hope's forehead and squeezed Ella's hand in farewell. "You've got a fine family here," he said quietly, glancing toward Nathaniel and Daniel. "Different from what you expected, perhaps, but a family nonetheless." Ella felt tears spring to her eyes at his understanding. "Thank you, Owen, for everything." The old man nodded, then turned to Nathaniel. "Take care of them," he said simply. Nathaniel clasped his arm in a gesture of respect. "With my life," he promised. As Owen trudged away through the deep snow, Ella couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. The tracks Willow had found the Watcher in the night Armstrong wasn't finished with them. And now, with Hope's arrival, the stakes were even higher. The day passed slowly. Ella, still weak from childbirth, dozed frequently, waking to nurse Hope or to eat the nourishing broth Willow prepared. Nathaniel spent much of the day outside, reinforcing their defenses and searching for any further signs of intruders. Daniel alternated between helping his father and sitting quietly beside Ella, watching over the baby with a protectiveness that touched her deeply. By evening, Ella felt strong enough to sit at the table for dinner, Hope cradled in one arm. The simple meal rabbit stew and cornbread tasted wonderful after the exertion of birth. As they ate, a fragile sense of normalcy settled over the cabin. "She looks like you," Nathaniel observed unexpectedly, his eyes on Hope's sleeping face. Ella smiled. "Do you think so? I was hoping she would favor Jacob." "She has your determination," he clarified. "I can see it already." Coming from him, it was a significant compliment. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel, sitting beside his father, studied Hope with solemn attention. "Will she talk soon?" he asked. Ella chuckled. "Not for many months yet. First she'll learn to smile, then laugh, then maybe make sounds. Words come later." Daniel nodded, absorbing this information. "I can teach her," he offered, "when she's ready." "I would like that very much," Ella replied, touched by his offer. Willow, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meal, suddenly stiffened. "Someone comes," she said, rising from the table in one fluid motion. Nathaniel was on his feet, instantly reaching for his knife. "How many?" "Several," Willow replied, moving to the window. "From the north," moving quietly. Fear clutched at Ella's heart. She held Hope tighter, her eyes seeking Nathaniel's. "Armstrong." Before he could answer, a sharp knock sounded at the door. They all froze, eyes locked on the wooden barrier that suddenly seemed frighteningly inadequate. The knock came again, followed by a woman's voice, clear, commanding, and speaking in Miwok. Willow's eyes widened in recognition. She said something rapid to Nathaniel, who looked equally shocked. "What is it?" Ella asked, alarmed by their reaction. "Who's there?" "Singing Bird," Nathaniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The medicine woman from our village. We thought she died in the attack." Willow was already moving to the door, lifting the bar, with hands that trembled slightly, the first sign of strong emotion Ella had seen from her. She pulled the door open to reveal a group of 5 native people, led by an elderly woman wrapped in a fur-lined cloak. The old woman entered, bringing with her the scent of sage and pine. Her face was deeply lined, her hair white as the snow outside, but her dark eyes were alert and assessing as they moved around the cabin, taking in each person in turn. She spoke in Miwok, her voice surprisingly strong for one of her years. Nathaniel answered respectfully, gesturing toward Ella and Hope. The old woman approached them, her gaze now fixed on the infant. "This is Singing Bird," Nathaniel explained to Ella. "She was our healer, our spiritual guide. We believed she perished with the others." Singing Bird stopped before Ella, studying her with ancient eyes that seemed to see beyond surfaces. Then, to Ella's surprise, she smiled and spoke in perfect, if accented, English. "So this is the brave one who stands against the Red-Beard killer," she said. "And this," her gnarled finger gently touched Hope's cheek, "is the child of 2 worlds." Ella blinked in confusion. 2 worlds? "Her father walked between worlds," Singing Bird explained. "He respected our ways, protected our sacred places. His spirit watches over her." Her eyes moved to Nathaniel, as does another. An uncomfortable silence followed this cryptic statement. Nathaniel looked away, his expression guarded. Willow spoke then rapid questions in their native tongue. Singing Bird answered, her voice becoming grave. Nathaniel's face darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Ella asked, sensing bad news. Nathaniel hesitated, then translated. "Singing Bird says Armstrong has gathered men not from town, but outsiders, mercenaries from the mining camps. They plan to come tomorrow at dawn." Fear gripped Ella's heart. But why Edgar is dead? The gold claim is protected by Jacob's will. Armstrong doesn't care about the gold, Nathaniel explained grimly. His hatred goes deeper. He wants revenge for his wife leaving him for his humiliation yesterday. And now, he glanced at Singing Bird. He knows about the sacred valley. How could he know that? Ella asked, alarmed. The native who guided Edgar to our village years ago, Singing Bird replied. A broken man named Crow's Wing cast out for crimes against our people. He has told Armstrong of Eagle's Nest Valley. And Armstrong wants to destroy it, Nathaniel concluded, to erase all trace of my people from these mountains. Ella tried to process this new threat. How many men does he have? 15, Willow answered. All armed. They plan to burn the cabin with us inside, then proceed to the valley. But the sheriff is 3 days' ride away, investigating another matter. Singing Bird interrupted. Armstrong knows this. It is why he acts now. Ella looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the danger gathering around them. Then at Daniel, his small face solemn with understanding beyond his years. They had survived Edgar's threat, only to face an even greater one. We must leave, Willow insisted. Tonight, under cover of darkness. Singing Bird knows paths through the mountains that even I do not. Ella cannot travel, Nathaniel objected. Not so soon after childbirth, and the baby is too small for such a journey in this cold. They will die if they stay, Willow countered harshly. No one is going to die, Ella said with sudden determination. Not my daughter, not Daniel, not any of us. She looked at Singing Bird. You said the other survivors from your village would help us. How many are there? 12 who can fight, the old woman replied. But they are scattered, hidden in the high places. Can you reach them by morning? Ella asked. Singing Bird nodded slowly, a glint of approval in her ancient eyes. Yes, but even with their help, we would be outnumbered. Not if we choose the battlefield, Nathaniel said, beginning to understand Ella's thinking. Not if we lead them where we want them to go. A plan began to form, born of desperation, but not without hope. They would not flee, nor would they make a final stand at the cabin. Instead, they would draw Armstrong and his men into Eagle's Nest Valley itself, the very place they sought to desecrate. There, with the advantage of terrain and Singing Bird's knowledge, they might have a chance. It's risky, Nathaniel cautioned. If they realize what we're doing, they won't, Ella insisted. Armstrong's hatred has made him careless. He'll follow where we lead, certain of his victory. Singing Bird nodded her approval. The brave one speaks wisely. Sometimes the deer must lead the hunter to where the mountain lion waits. They spent the next hours in intense preparation. Singing Bird dispatched her companions to gather the scattered survivors. Nathaniel and Willow prepared weapons and supplies for the journey to the valley. Even Daniel helped sorting provisions and packing them carefully under Willow's direction. Ella, still too weak for physical labor, focused on Hope's needs, ensuring the newborn was fed and warmly wrapped for what lay ahead. As she worked, a strange calm settled over her. The fear remained, but beneath it was a bedrock of determination. She had not survived Edgar's schemes, given birth in a mountain cabin, only to lose everything now. By midnight, they were ready. The cabin had been prepared to appear occupied, fire banked, but still giving off smoke, shutters closed, as if against the night, a lantern visible through the window. In reality, they would be long gone by the time Armstrong arrived. Are you certain you can make the journey? Nathaniel asked Ella privately as the others made final preparations. His concern was evident in the furrow of his brow, the tension around his eyes. I don't have a choice, she replied simply. Hope's life depends on it. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. You are stronger than you know, Ella Harmon." Something in the way he said her name made her heart flutter despite their dire circumstances. "As are you, Nathaniel Redpath." They set out under a moonless sky, the stars painfully bright in the black expanse above. Singing Bird led the way, her knowledge of the hidden paths allowing them to move swiftly despite the deep snow. Nathaniel carried Hope the infant secured against his chest in a sling Willow had fashioned. Daniel walked between Ella and Willow, his small face set with determination. The journey was grueling. Every step cost Ella effort, her body still recovering from childbirth. But she pressed on, refusing to become the liability Willow had feared. Occasionally, Hope would whimper, and they would stop briefly for Ella to nurse her before continuing their ascent into the mountains. By false dawn, they had reached Eagle's Nest Valley, a high sheltered basin surrounded by towering cliffs. Even in winter, its beauty was breathtaking. A frozen stream wound through its center, and stands of ancient pine created natural barriers and hiding places. "This is it," Nathaniel said softly. "The place Jacob and I found. The sacred valley." Ella gazed around, understanding why the Miwok considered it special. There was a presence here, a sense of age and permanence that made human concerns seem fleeting by comparison. They were not the first to arrive. As Singing Bird had promised, other survivors had gathered men and women with the same quiet determination in their eyes that Ella had seen in Nathaniel's. They greeted Willow and Singing Bird with subdued joy, and Nathaniel with a respect that bordered on reverence. Daniel they welcomed as one of their own, enfolding him in brief embraces before returning to their preparations. "They honor you," Ella observed to Nathaniel as they watched the Miwok warriors position themselves around the valley. "They honor what I represent," he corrected. "The last of my father's line, a bridge between their world and yours." He glanced down at Hope, still sleeping against his chest. "As your daughter will be in her time." The implication of his words, that he saw a future where Hope would grow up, knowing both cultures, warmed Ella, despite the bitter cold. Singing Bird approached them, her ancient face grave. "They come," she said simply, "sooner than expected. The broken one crow's wing has led them well." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "How many?" 20, Singing Bird replied. "More than we thought. They have been joined by others who seek the gold." The news was sobering. Even with the valley's advantages, they were still outnumbered. "Take Ella and the children to the cave," Nathaniel instructed Singing Bird. "Keep them safe while we deal with Armstrong." "No," Ella protested. "I won't hide while others fight for us." "You must," Nathaniel insisted. "Hope needs her mother, and if we fail—" He couldn't finish the thought. Ella wanted to argue further, but the practicality of his request was undeniable. She was in no condition to fight, and Hope's survival had to be her priority. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said instead. "All of you." Nathaniel's eyes softened. "I promise to return," he said. It wasn't quite the same thing, but it was all he could honestly offer. Singing Bird led Ella, Daniel, and Hope to a hidden cave high on the valley's eastern slope. From its entrance, they could see much of what transpired below while remaining concealed from view. "Wait here," the old woman instructed. "No matter what you see or hear, do not leave this place until I or Nathaniel comes for you." Ella nodded, settling Hope more securely in her arms. Daniel pressed against her side, his eyes wide with worry. "Will Papa be all right?" he whispered. "Your father is very brave and very smart," Ella assured him, hoping her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "He knows how to take care of himself." Daniel seemed to accept this, though his small body remained tense with anxiety. From their elevated position, they watched as Armstrong's party entered the valley from the south. They moved in a loose formation, rifles ready, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. At their head rode Armstrong himself, his black coat making him look like a crow against the snow. Beside him walked a native man, crow's wing, presumably his face marked with old scars, his posture that of a broken spirit. The Miwok defenders remained hidden, allowing the intruders to advance into the center of the valley. Ella could see Nathaniel positioned behind a fallen log willow, a short distance away, in the shadow of a large pine. Others waited among the rocks and trees, bows ready. When Armstrong's party reached the frozen stream at the valley's heart, Nathaniel stepped into view. He stood tall and unarmed, his presence commanding, despite being alone against 20 armed men. "That's far enough, Armstrong," his voice carried clearly in the still air. The Reverend reined in his horse, his thin face twisting with hatred. "The half-breed himself," he sneered. "I was hoping you'd be foolish enough to show yourself." "This is sacred ground," Nathaniel said evenly. "You don't belong here." Armstrong laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Sacred. This land belongs to those who can take it savage. Just like that whore of yours belonged to me before she ran back to your kind." Ella gasped at the cruel words, understanding now the depth of Armstrong's hatred. It wasn't just about his Miwok wife leaving him, she had left him for Nathaniel's people, perhaps even for someone in Nathaniel's family. Nathaniel remained unmoved by the provocation. "Your quarrel is with me, Armstrong. Let it end here between us." "Oh, it will end here," Armstrong agreed, drawing his pistol. "With your death and the death of every last one of your kind hiding in these mountains, starting with that widow and her half-breed loving brat." At his signal, his men spread out, rifles raised. But before they could fire, the valley erupted into action. Arrows flew from a dozen hidden positions, finding targets with deadly accuracy. Warriors emerged from concealment, engaging Armstrong's mercenaries in close combat. The element of surprise gave the defenders an initial advantage, but Armstrong's men were hardened fighters with superior weapons. The battle quickly became desperate and chaotic. Ella watched in horror as Willow fell an arrow, not from a Miwok bow, protruding from her shoulder. Nathaniel was fighting two men at once, his knife flashing in the early light. Blood stained the snow in crimson patches, marking where fighters had fallen. "We have to help them," Daniel cried, trying to pull away from Ella's restraining arm. "We can't," she replied, though every instinct screamed at her to do something, anything to aid those fighting below. "We promised to stay here." But as the battle continued, it became clear the defenders were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Armstrong remained on his horse, directing his men with cold efficiency, picking off Miwok warriors with precise shots from his pistol. Hope began to wail, as if sensing the desperation of the moment. Ella tried to soothe her, but her own fear made it difficult. The baby's cries echoed in the cave, a sound of life and innocence amid the violence below. And then, incredibly, another sound joined Hope's cries, hoofbeats approaching fast from the north. Ella strained to see through the trees, hope rising despite herself. A large party of riders burst into the valley, led by Sheriff Durant, with Owen Miller at his side. Behind them came at least 15 deputies and townsmen, including several Ella recognized as miners who had respected Jacob. "That's enough, Armstrong," Durant's voice boomed across the valley. "Drop your weapons, all of you." The fighting stuttered to a halt as both sides registered the new arrivals. Armstrong, his face contorted with fury, swung his pistol toward the sheriff. "This is none of your concern, Durant," he snarled. "These savages are trespassing on company land." "That's where you're wrong, Reverend," Owen called out. "This land belongs to the Harmon estate, according to Jacob's will, which we found in Sacramento yesterday. And the estate's executor has granted sanctuary to the Miwok people here." Armstrong's face registered shock. "What executor? The widow can't—" "Not the widow," Durant corrected. "Jacob Harmon's lawyer, Mr. Simmons. He arrived from Sacramento this morning with the properly filed will and all supporting documents." Ella felt a surge of gratitude toward Owen. The old man had not only reached town safely, but had somehow managed to locate Jacob's lawyer and bring help in time. Armstrong, seeing his plan unraveling, made a desperate decision. He spurred his horse directly toward Nathaniel, who stood exposed in the open snow. "You've taken everything from me!" Armstrong screamed, firing his pistol. "My wife! My reputation! I'll see you in hell!" The bullet struck Nathaniel in the chest, sending him sprawling into the snow. Ella's cry of anguish joined Daniel's scream of "Papa!" Before Armstrong could fire again, a single arrow struck him in the throat. He toppled from his horse, blood spurting from the wound. Ella looked to see who had fired, and was shocked to find it was Crow's Wing, the broken man, who had guided Armstrong to the valley. His face was transformed by a terrible resolve as he lowered his bow. "For my people," he said clearly. "For my redemption." The mercenaries, seeing their leader fall, and faced with lawmen's guns, quickly surrendered. The battle was over almost as suddenly as it had begun. Ella could wait no longer. Heedless of Singing Bird's warning, she gathered Hope close and began descending toward the valley floor, Daniel clutching her skirt as they navigated the steep path. Her only thought was of Nathaniel. He couldn't be dead. Not now, not when they had survived so much, not when hope was just beginning to take root. She reached him before the others, falling to her knees beside his still form. Blood stained the snow beneath him, spreading in a crimson pool that spoke of mortal injury. "Nathaniel." She choked, tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter cold. "Please, don't leave us." His eyelids fluttered, then opened. Those winter sky eyes found hers, clouded with pain, but still alert. "Ella," he whispered. "Hope, Daniel. They're safe," she assured him, as Daniel pressed against her side, his small face wet with tears. "We're all safe now." A ghost of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." His eyes began to close again, strength fading. "No," Ella cried. "Stay with me. Stay with us." Singing Bird appeared beside them, her ancient hands moving swiftly to examine the wound. "The bullet passed through," she announced. "Clean. If we stop the bleeding, he may live." Those simple words, "he may live," were the most beautiful Ella had ever heard. Hope stirred against her chest, as if adding her own encouragement. What followed was a blur of activity. Durant's men helped transport Nathaniel to the cave where Singing Bird could work on him properly. The wounded from both sides were tended to, the dead respectfully covered. Armstrong's body was loaded onto a pack horse for return to town, his ambitions and hatred ended by the arrow of the man he had corrupted. Owen made his way to Ella's side, his weathered face split by a triumphant grin despite the gravity of the situation. "We found it, my dear," he announced. "The will." Jacob had filed it with Simmons in Sacramento months ago with specific instructions in case of his untimely death. Ella, exhausted beyond measure, but determined to stay awake until she knew Nathaniel would survive, managed a weak smile. "What does it say?" "Everything goes to you and the child," Owen confirmed. "With one specific provision, that the Eagle's Nest Valley be held in trust for the Miwok people as agreed between Jacob and Nathaniel Redpath." His eyes twinkled. Your husband was a forward-thinking man, Ella. He recognized the injustice done to these people and tried to make it right in his own way. Yes, Ella agreed softly. That sounds like Jacob. Durant approached his expression sympathetic, but official. Mrs. Harmon, once Mr. Redpath is stable, we'll need to transport him to town for proper medical care. You and the children as well. He glanced at Hope, still miraculously sleeping, despite the chaos. That little one should see a doctor, being early and all. Ella nodded, too tired to argue even if she'd wanted to. Thank you, Sheriff, for coming when you did. Durant shrugged modestly. Thank Miller here. He's the one who rode halfway to Sacramento to fetch the lawyer, then convinced half the town that Armstrong had gone mad. He adjusted his hat. Though I reckon most folks already suspected as much after his behavior at Edgar's funeral. The mention of Edgar reminded Ella of how much had transpired in such a short time. It seemed a lifetime ago that she had stood in Goldridge's auction square, offering her wedding ring for a stranger's freedom. Now that stranger had become, friend, protector, something more that she wasn't ready to name. Hours later, as the winter sun began its early descent, Singing Bird emerged from the cave where she had been tending to Nathaniel. Her ancient face was lined with fatigue, but her eyes held cautious optimism. He lives, she announced. The wound is clean, the bleeding stopped. His spirit is strong. He chooses to stay in this world. Relief washed over Ella like a physical force. Can I see him? Singing Bird nodded. He asks for you, and for the children. Inside the cave, Nathaniel lay on a pallet of furs, his chest heavily bandaged. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were clear when they found Ella. You're still here, he said softly. I thought perhaps I had dreamed you. We're here, she confirmed, sinking down beside him with Hope in her arms. Daniel immediately went to his father's side, careful not to touch the bandaged wound. Papa, the boy said, his voice small with lingering fear. You got hurt. Nathaniel's hand rose to touch his son's cheek. But I am healing, he assured him, thanks to Singing Bird's wisdom and your bravery in staying with Ella and Hope. Daniel nodded solemnly, accepting the praise. We're going to town, he informed his father. The sheriff said so, for doctors. Nathaniel's eyes moved to Ella, questioning. She nodded. Durant thinks it's best, for Hope and for you. And then, he asked quietly, it was the question that had been hovering between them unspoken until now. What came next? Where would they go from here? The will gives me back everything, Ella said carefully. The house in town, the land. There would be room for all of us. She held her breath, suddenly, afraid of his answer. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from Ella to Hope to Daniel, as if memorizing their faces. Are you certain? He finally asked. Your people may not accept. They'll learn to, she said firmly. Or they won't. Either way, we'll face it together. She took a deep breath. If that's what you want. What I want, he repeated softly. His hand found hers, his grip weak but determined. What I want is to see Hope grow strong, to hear Daniel laugh again, to build something lasting from all this pain and loss. His eyes held hers, more vulnerable than she had ever seen them. To be with you, Ella Harmon, however you will have me. The simple declaration, so heartfelt and direct, brought fresh tears to Ella's eyes. That's what I want too, she whispered. All of it. Hope stirred against her chest, tiny fingers flexing in sleep. Daniel, sensing the shift in emotion, leaned against Ella's side, his small hand finding hers. And Nathaniel, wounded but alive, held her gaze with a promise more binding than any vow. Outside the cave, the survivors of both sides prepared to journey back to town, the first steps toward a new understanding, a different future than any of them had imagined. The golden afternoon light spilled across Eagle's Nest Valley, illuminating the snow, the trees, the people moving with purpose across its sacred ground. "We should name her," Nathaniel said suddenly, looking at the infant in Ella's arms. "I already have," Ella replied. "Her name is Hope." Nathaniel smiled, the first true smile she had seen from him. "Hope," he repeated. "Perfect." And it was perfect, not just the name, but the moment, the feeling between them, the promise of what was to come. From gold and blood on the Sierra, they had forged something precious and rare. A family, a future, a hope that would endure long after the snow melted and the mountains greened again with spring.